We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 90a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing a Murei Kachim Kalim before Zrikas Hadam. In general, when it comes to a Murei Kachim Kalim, those are the sacrificial portions of Kachim Kalim which are burned on the Mizbeach. It's only after the Zrikas Hadam. The Zrikas Hadam is the matir, that's the permitter that allows the sacrificial portions to be burned on the Mizbeach. And in cases of karbonos which are eaten, it allows those portions of the carbon to be eaten. And so after the Zrikas Hadam, we say the Murei Kachim Kalim belong to the Mizbeach, so to speak, and there is Me'ilah, but before Zrikas Hadam, there is no Me'ilah. And on the previous summit, Ravina Bar Shila said that even though a Murei Kachim Kalim before Zrikas Hadam, there is no Me'ilah, but still, when it comes to those Murei Kachim Kalim, if they were to leave the Azara before Zrika, they would be disqualified through Yotzei, through leaving the Azara. That was what Ravina Bar Shila said on the previous summit. And on the previous summit, the Gemara suggested that this is possibly a machlokas tanoim, because the Brisa discusses a murim kachim kalim before Zrikas Hadam, again, that leave the Azara. The same case of Ravina Bar Shila. And Rabbi Eliezer says that in such a situation, with regards to those imurim, there is no me'ilah. And the assumption over here is that Rabbi Eliezer is saying there is no me'ilah even after the Zrika. In other words, if those imurim, if they leave before Zrika, and then let's say the Zrika is done, so the Zrika is not going to be able to be koveya that there is me'ilah now, even after the Zrika. And further, Rabbi Eliezer says, Ve'ein chayav alein, one is not liable with regards to them, mishum pigol noser v'tamei, in terms of pigol noser and tamei. We will see Rashi in a moment, but none of those apply, again, in a situation of the Murei Kachim Kalim that leave the Azara before the Zrikas Hadam. And Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and Rabbi Akiva says, Mo'alin behen, there is me'ilah. V'chayav alein mishum pigol noser v'tamei, and one could be liable on them for pigol noser and tamei. And so the Gemara says, my lav is it not? B'dehadar ailinhu pligi. The machlokas over here is when they were then brought back into the Azara. Uvahad pligi, and they're arguing exactly on this issue. Demar savar mifsali b'yotzei. Rabbi Eliezer says they were already disqualified through Yotzei, and that's why since they were disqualified, none of these apply. There's no me'ilah, pigol, noser, or tamei. Umar savar lo mifsali b'yotzei. And Rabbi Akiva says they were not disqualified through Yotzei. That's why it's possible that there is me'ilah, there is pigol, there is noser, and there is tamei. And Rashi explains, Ve'in chayavan alein mishum pigol. Again, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no liability of pigol. Dehavalu kamishalo nizrak alein hadam, because it's as if the blood was not thrown on them. Velo karvu kol matirein, so not all of their matir was offered. Again, we've said earlier that when it comes to pigol, it has to be that the matir was brought. Umishum noser, and there's no liability of noser. Rashi says, De'ein noser ela bebasar la'achila. Noser only applies by meat that's to be eaten, b'soch zmano, in the proper time. K'dechsib b'yom zivchachem ya'achel mimacharas. Mishum Tomas Haguf, and also there is no liability for Tomas Haguf, says Rabbi Eliezer, Kedamrinan b'menachas, like we say in menachas, Hanitar l'tahorin, that which is permitted for those who are pure, Chayavin olav mishum tuma. So then there's a liability for tuma. She'ein nitar l'tahorin, but if it's not mutter, so ein chayavin olav mishum tuma. So then there is no liability of tuma. Ve'imurin de'israbu l'tuma. Now the fact that imurim are included in terms of the liability of tuma, me'asher la'Hashem dumyo debasar israbu, it has to be similar to what we find by meat. It's only after Zrika that we say there's a liability of Tumah when it comes to the Emurim. Velo lefnei Zrika, not before Zrika. And again, Vahani lo ahani lo Zrika. The whole point is that over here, with regards to these Emurim, the Zrika is ineffective. That is the point. And again, the Gemara then says, My lav b'hadar ailinu. Aren't we talking here where it's then brought back into the Azara? But the question just is whether it was disqualified. Meaning, the hava legavoy b'shas Zrika. The machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva is in a situation where the Emurim were within the Azar at the time of the Zrika, and Pligi, that's what they're arguing about. And again, the machlokus is whether it's already been disqualified. Even though it's in the Azar at the time of the Zrika, Rabbi Eliezer says the Zrika is not effective. That's the point of Rabbi Eliezer. Mishum de'ifsilu b'yotzei, because of the fact that they became disqualified through Yotzei. That's what the Gemara is suggesting, and therefore, again, this issue would be a machlokus tanoim. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Papa says, B'dehadar ailinu kuli alma lo pligi. It could be that according to the Brisa, if the Emurim were brought back into the Azar, there would be no machlokas. Everybody would agree that there's me'ilah and there's liability of pigol, noser, and tamei, because the Zrika is effective for those Emurim. V'hachan over here in this Brisa, B'di isnu avroi pligi. It could be that the case is the Emurim were still outside the Azar at the time of the Zrika, and that's the machlokas. Uvahad pligi, and they're arguing as follows, the Mar savar ein Zrika moelas liyotzei. One says that Zrika is not effective if it is outside the Azara. Umar Savar Zrika Moelis Liyotzi. And the other one says that Zrika is effective even if it's outside of the Azara. But the Gemara continues and asks, Rav Papa hu da'amar, but Rav Papa is the one that said, B'di'isnu avroi kuli alma lo pligi, that when they are outside, actually there's no machlokas in such a situation. And on the contrary, B'da'ilinu legavoi pligi, that the machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva is when they're brought inside of the Azara. And Rashi explains, Rav Papa hu da'amar b'menachos b'perak atchelas, this is Rav Papa in Menachos, in perak atchelas, gabe shtei halechem, he's talking there about the shtei halechem. Over there, if the shtei halechem sheyotzu ben shchita l'zrika, let's say the shtei halechem, they left the Azara between the slaughtering and the zrika, the pligi nami Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Akiva. We have the same exact machlokas over there between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and in explaining that machlokas, says Rav Papa, b'de'isnu avroi kuli alma lo pligi, if they're still outside, everybody agrees. There is no argument to lo mahani lahu zrika, that the zrika is not going to be effective. So how is it that he's saying over there that b'de'isnu avroi kuli alma lo pligi, and the whole machlokas is when they're brought back inside, but over here we're saying that the machlokas is when they murim are outside of the Azara. And the Gemara continues and answers that the shtei halechem case is different. Hani mili gabe shtei lechem, that's true by the shtei halechem. The lav gufei de zivcha, that's not actually, it's not the actual carbon that's being slaughtered, it is accompanying the carbon. And so therefore, in such a situation, when we're talking about the shtei halechem, there everybody agrees. If it's outside of the Azara at the time of the zrika is certainly not going to be effective. And the machlokas is when it's brought back inside, whether that zrika is considered to be effective on the shtei halechem. Avol emurim, but when it comes to the sacrificial portions, the gufei de zivchahu, that's the emurim, the portions of the actual carbon that's being slaughtered. So they're already b'di'isnu avroi pligi. They're the machlokas is when they actually are outside the Azara at the time of the zrika, and there is a possibility, that's why there's a machlokas, there would be more of a possibility that the zrika would be effective for those emurim. And Rashi explains, the lav gufei de zivchahu, that the shtei halechem is not the actual animal being slaughtered, the vizrikas kevasim, because it's through the throwing of the blood of the lambs, kam mishtaru, that's how the shtei halechem are permitted. The lav gufayuhu, again, that's not the actual animal. Hilkach kol de isnu avroi, therefore, as long as it's outside of the Azara, mod Rabbi Akiva, there Rabbi Akiva would actually admit, there'd be no machlokas. Rabbi Akiva would agree, the lo mahanya lahu zrika, that the zrika is not going to be effective, and the machlokas is when it's brought back in the Azara. But over here, again, when it comes to the emurim, which are the actual gufei de zivcha, so there the machlokas tanoim is when they are outside of the Azara. And before continuing, we will note over here that when the Braisa mentioned pigul, noser, and tameh, those do apply to the emurim as well, even though the emurim are not eaten by individuals, they're consumed by the mizbeach, they're burned on the mizbeach, but that is considered to be achila. We'll also note that in Rashi, when Rashi says noser de'ein noser ela bebasar, there is an alternate girsa in the Shenuyah Nuschos, has bekosher la'achila. It has to be something which is kosher la'achila, meaning there has been a matir, there's been a zrikas adam that permits it, but that does not only mean, again, for the individuals who eat the carbon, that applies to the mizbeach as well. When the mizbeach consumes the carbon, when it's burned on the mizbeach, that's called achila, and that's why, again, pigul, noser, and tameh are relevant when it comes to the emurim as well. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ofos, Kodman, V'chulu. It said that bird karbanos, they come before karban mincha because they involve blood. And the Gemara asks, Adarab, on the contrary, Menachos Kodmos, we should say the karban mincha takes precedence. Shekein yeshnon b'tzibur kaviyachid, because there's such a thing as a minchas tzibur, as a communal mincha, just like there's an individual mincha. That is not true by bird karbanos. And the Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, minei damim adife, again, if it involves blood, the types of karbanos with blood, so then it is better, it takes precedence. And Rashi explains, Menachos yeshnan b'tzibur, we do find karban mincha by a communal mincha. For example, minchas ha'omer, shtei halechem, we find it by the minchas ha'omer, which is by Pesach, and the shtei halechem, which is by Shavuos. So those are karban mincha that are communal karban mincha. But of eino b'tzibur, when it comes to a bird karban that is not communal, the Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, v'hikriv hayachid mevi of, it says the individual brings the bird karban, ve'in tzibur mevi an of, a community does not bring a bird karban. And so therefore, again, karban mincha applies b'tzibur, not ofos, but nevertheless, the Gemara says minei damim is adife. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Minchas chote, that a Minchas chote, the mincha of a sinner, that comes before the Minchas nedava, which is a donated karban mincha. The Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, Minchas nedava kodemis, we should say that the Minchas nedava takes precedence, Shekain te'una shemenu lavona, because it requires oil and it requires frankincense. But the Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, Minchas chote haba al chet adifa de mechaperes. The Minchas chote, which is brought because of a sin, that is greater because it is mechaperes, it brings an atonement. And the Gemara continues, they had the following question, Minchas Sota, Minchas Nadava. What about a Minchas Sota and a Minchas Nadava? Minchas Sota is not brought for sin, but it is meant to clarify whether there was a sin involving the Sota. So Ezu Mehen Kodemis, which one of those comes first? Minchas Nadava Kadma. One could argue that the Minchas Nadava comes first. Shekena Te'una Shemen Ulavona, because again it requires oil and frankincense. That is not true by the Mincha of the Sota. O Dilmar, maybe Minchas Sota Kidma, maybe the Minchas Sota comes first. Shekain bol levar avon, because it comes to clarify sin. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come and hear the following proof. It says in the Mishnah again, Minchas chote kodemis leminchas nadava. The Minchas chote, the mincha of the sinner, comes before the Minchas nadava, and so we can infer Minchas chote hu de kadma leminchas nadava. The Minchas chote comes before the Minchas nadava. Ha Minchas sota lo, but it sounds like the Minchas sota would not come before the Minchas nadava. But the Gemara continues, Mi katani mipnei shehi mechaperes. Does it say in the Mishnah the Minchas Chote comes first because it is a kapara? That would imply only the Minchas Chote and not the Minchas Sota, which is not a kapara. But it doesn't say that. Mipnei shehi ba al chet katani. It says that it comes for a sin. V'hanami ba al chet. And when it comes to the Minchas Sote, that also comes for a sin. It doesn't come as a kapara for a sin, but it comes to clarify sin. And so therefore, again, we cannot infer from the Mishnah that Minchas Sote does not take precedence to Minchas Nadava. And Rashi explains, Minchas Chote hi de kodemis leminchas Nadava. The Minchas Chote comes before Minchas Nadava, Mishum de Mechaperes, because it's an atonement. Avol Minchas Sota lo, but Minchas Sota, that would not be true. V'hanami, but then the Gemara said this also, de Sota ba al chet. When it comes to the Minchas Sota, that also comes for a sin. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come and hear the following proof. This is a Braisa, Zu kodemes lezu. It says this comes before this. Shezu ba min hachitin, because this comes from wheat. V'zu ba min hasaor, and this comes from barley. Now Minchas Sota does come from barley. When it comes to Minchas Chote or Minchas Nadava, those come from wheat. So the question is, what exactly is this Braisa talking about? The Gemara says, my lav is not Minchas Nadava le Minchas Sota. Isn't the Braisa saying that the Minchas Nadava, which comes from wheat, it precedes the Minchas Chote, which the Minchas Sota rather, which comes from barley? And the Gemara says, lo no Minchas Chote le Minchas Sota. Maybe the Braisa means the Minchas Chote, which also comes from wheat. That takes precedence to the Minchas Sota. But the Gemara says, if that were the case, typically the mechaperes v'holo mechaperes. But if that's the case, why are you bringing the distinction of wheat and barley? Just say that the Minchas Chote is a mechaperes, it's an atonement, and the Minchas Sota is not a mechaperes, it's not an atonement. That's the reason the Braisa should have given. But the Gemara says to that, v'yelamai, but what are you going to say? Minchas Nadava? You'll say the Braisa is talking about Minchas Nadava that precedes the Minchas Sota. Typically, the zu te'una shemen ulavona. Then the Braisa could have said something else also. It could have said that the Minchas Nadava requires oil and frankincense. V'zu eina te'una shemen ulavona. The Minchas Sota does not require oil and frankincense. And so the Gemara says, elachad mitrei time inoket. You have to say that the Braisa is just choosing one of two possible reasons, and therefore we don't know exactly what the Braisa is referring to. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Chatas ha'of kodemes, that the Chatas ha'of comes before the Olas ha'of. And the Gemara says, Menahani mili, from where do we know this? And we will take a look at Tosfos. Tosfos say, Menahani mili detan rabbanan, la'el gabe dam chatas kodem ladam ola. Earlier, by the blood of the chatas that precedes the blood of the ola, nicha de boikra. Makes sense that the Gemara would ask for psukim, for sources for this idea. Afagav de meforish taima b'masnisin. Even though the reason is given in the Mishnah says that dam chatas comes before dam ola, because of the fact essentially that dam chatas is mechaperes, but yet the Gemara asks for sources from psukim. And why? Mishum di'ika trei kroi, because there are actually two psukim. There are psukim that have conflicting views. Chad de mashma de chatas kodemes. One pasuk seems to be saying that chatas comes first. V'chad de mashma de ola kodemes, and one that seems to be saying that ola comes first. And therefore the Gemara earlier clarifies that. But Tosfos ask, Aval hacha, but over here kasha, it's difficult. Lama likra, why do we need a pasuk to explain why the chatas ha'of comes before the ola ha'of? Typically, mishum the chatas ha'of meratza. We should give the reason that's given in the Mishnah again by dam chatas and dam ola. It should be that the chatas ha'of is meratza. Again, it affects acceptance in terms of kapara. Why isn't that a sufficient reason? Why does the Gemara here need to bring sources? And Tosfos continue and answer v'shem, and maybe we can answer kevon de lesbo haktara. Since when it comes to chatas ha'of, there is no haktara by a chatas ha'of. So over there, the blood is applied to the mizbeach, but then the rest is eaten. There's nothing that's burned on the mizbeach, whereas an olas ha'of, of course, is burned on the mizbeach. So lo mahani bo ha'taim, you can't give that reason, because one might actually say that the olas ha'of should take precedence, because it's actually, there's some part of it, or all of it really, that's burned on the mizbeach. And so therefore that's why the Gemara is asking for sources again, then chatas ha'of comes before olas ha'of. So again the Gemara asks, Minahani Mili, from where do we know this? And the Gemara says, the Tanu Rabbanan, that the rabbis taught. V'hikriv es asher lachatos rishon, it says that the one that is chatos, that is brought first. Ma Talmud lomar, why does the pasuk have to say that? Shein Talmud lomar lelamed shetikrav rishon. It cannot be that the pasuk here is saying that the chatos comes first. Harei kvar nemar, because the pasuk already says, v'yas hasheni yasa ola, it says that the second one is brought as an ola. Elo ze bonaav, rather this pasuk is a binyan av, it sets a general rule, l'chol chatos sheyiktamu la'ola habos imohen, that all chatos, they should precede the ola that comes along with them. Bein chatos ha'of la'ola sa'of, whether we're talking about a chatos ha'of, that it should precede an ola sa'of. Bein chatos behema la'olas behema, whether we're talking about a chatos behema, that it should precede an olas behema. And va'afilu chatos ha'of la'olas behema, even a chatos ha'of should take precedence over an olas behema, the ola, an animal ola. And hilkach, therefore, chatas ha'of la'olas ha'of, when we say that a chatas ha'of precedes an olas ha'of, V'es hasheni, that comes from the pasuk of v'es hasheni that we just quoted above. And chatas behema la'olas behema, the fact that a chatas behema comes before an olas behema, mider Rabbi Rachmana, that's from the inclusion of the pasuk that we brought earlier. And chatas ha'of la'olas behema, the fact that a chatas ha'of precedes an olas behema, mizeh bona'av, that's from what we just said above of zeh bona'av. And Rashi explains, V'hikriv es asher lachatos, again it says in the pasuk, the chatos, the bird chatos is brought first, and then the bird ola. Rashi says, B'shmias hakol ksiv, this is written by Shmias hakol. These are various cases where if the person has enough money, so then they bring an animal chatos, but then if not, they bring two birds, one is a chatos and one is an ola, and if not, they bring a carbon mincha. It's called the variable chatos. And again, it says in the pasuk that the chatos is brought first, and then it also says that the ola is brought second, and we say zeh bona'av. Rashi continues, zeh bona'av toletam hakdamaso b'shvil shem chatos. Essentially, the pasuk is giving the reason why the chatos comes first, because it's called a chatos, and therefore it's a general rule that the chatos always comes first. Chatos behema la'olas behema mider Rabbi Rachmana. The chatos behema comes before the olas behema. That's from the inclusion in the pasuk, and this is what Tosas was referencing as well. The Gemara brought this earlier. Why chatos comes before ola? Detanya la'elu parsheni ben bakar. That's what we learned in a brisa earlier. Daf Peites Amid Beis parsheni ben bakar. And chatos ha'of la'olas behema. You also have a chatas ha'of that even comes before olas behema. Rashi says this is in limited situations where the two are coming together. Kagon yoledes ashira, for example, by a woman who's a yoledes. So the woman who's a yoledes is supposed to bring an olas behema, and then also supposed to bring a chatas ha'of. If she doesn't have enough money, so then the olas behema is replaced with an olas ha'of. So in this particular case, again, the chatas ha'of will come before the olas behema. The olas behema is keves ben shanaso le'ola. She brings a keves ben shanaso le'ola, uven yona osor lachatos, and then it says she brings a ben yona osor lachatos. She brings either a pigeon or a dove as a carbon chatas, and so again, in this situation where she's bringing both carbonos together, the chatas ha'of comes first. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here the following proof. The Brisa says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol mokum shenischalfa chatas, any time that is the chatas that's being exchanged for a bird chatas, so then chatas kodemis, then the chatas comes first. What Rabbi Eliezer is referring to is the case again of the variable chatas. In that situation, really the primary carbon that is supposed to be brought is the animal chatas, but if the person is not wealthy enough, so then they bring two birds, one is a chatas, one is an ola, and so then the chatas comes first, because the primary carbon was really a chatas. But Rabbi Eliezer is contrasting this with the case of Yoledis. Again, the case of Yoledis is really supposed to be a bird chatas all along, and then it's an animal ola. And so therefore, Vikan over here, when it comes to Yoledis, ola kodemis, so then the ola comes first, because really the bird that is being brought in exchange is being brought in exchange for the ola, and therefore really it is an ola that is supposed to be the primary, the animal carbon, and so the ola actually comes first, according to Rabbi Eliezer. And another argument for the same idea, kol makom sheba al chet, anytime it's coming for a sin, so then chatas kodemis, then the chatas comes first. The variable carbon chatas is coming for a sin, and so therefore when two birds are brought, the chatas ha'of comes first. Vikan, but over here, by the Oledis, the chatas that she is bringing is actually not for a sin, it's just a carbon that she brings after giving birth, so therefore again, ola kodemis, the ola is going to come first. And another argument, v'chol makom sheshnayim boim tachas chatas, anytime you have have two birds that are coming instead of a chatas, which again is what is happening by the variable chatas. Over there, primarily it's an animal chatas that's supposed to be brought. If the individual is not wealthy enough, so then the individual brings two birds, one is a chatas, one is an ola, so then chatas kodemes, then it makes sense that the chatas comes first. But again, vikan over here, when it comes to the yoledes, ola kodemes, the ola comes first. Again, primarily by the yoledes, she's supposed to be bringing an animal ola and a bird chatas. If she's not wealthy enough, she brings a bird for a chatas, but the ola comes first, and that goes against what we just said. We just said in the previous Gemara that the chatas ha'of always comes first, even before the olas behema, and so therefore this brisa seems to contradict that. And the Gemara continues and answers. Amar Rava says lemikra hikdima hakasav. All the brisa over here is saying is that in terms of the psukim that it comes first, but it's not saying in terms of what is brought first. And Rashi explains, Kol mokom sheneschalfa chatas, anytime that the chatas is being switched and instead v'ha'ofos boin tachteh, the birds are coming instead of the chatas, that's bedalus, that's when the person is poor. It's not dale dalus, when the person is very poor they bring a mincha, but when the person is just poor they bring the birds, kegon b'metami mikdash, like metami mikdash. That's also one of those cases in Vayikra Hey, which again there's the variable chatas, the ikaro chatas behema, that the main carbon should have been a chatas behema. Uvedalus neschalfa shtei sorim, and then a person is poor, so they bring the two birds. Chatas kodemes, so then the chatas comes first. Dechsiv la chatas rishona, it says the chatas is first. Mishum de ikar chatasu, because again the main carbon is the chatas. V'kan b'yoledes, but over here by yoledes, sha'of tachas olahuba, that the bird is coming instead of the ola. V'habehema ikar haisa ola kodemes, and the behemo, the animal was the ikar, so the ola comes first. Kedechsiv ba echad liola v'echad l'chatas, in the pasuk actually the ola is written first. It says echad liola v'echad l'chatas, so the ola comes first by the yoledes. If you have two birds coming for one chatas, so then the chatas comes first. Kagon again by metame mikdash, like by metame mikdash. Again, those are the cases in Vayikra Hey. Shtei ha'ofos tachas chatas echad hein boin. The two birds are instead of the one chatas. Sharei bashirus lo hayamechuyev al chatas. Again, if the person would have been wealthy, there's no ola. They only bring a carbon chatas. They can be yoledes, but here by yoledes she'ein bo tachas habehema ella ofa ola. Here it's just instead of the animal is just the bird ola. The ilu bashirus nami have a masya of lechatas im olas behema, because had she been wealthy also, she would still bring a bird chatas with the olas behema. Now it's a bird chatas with a bird ola. Ola kodemes, the ola comes first. And the point is, Alma, we see from Rabbi Eliezer, ola shel behema yoledes kodemes lachatas. The ola, the animal ola of a yoledes comes before the bird chatas. Shari av chalipin kodem lachatas. Even if you exchange for the animal for a bird, that's going to come first. The ola will come first. And the Shenuya Nuschos changes this to umas nisatan. In the brisa that we just learned above, we learned that chatas ha'of kodemes la olas behema, that the chatas ha'of comes before the olas behema, so it seems to be a contradiction. And then the Gemara Rava answered, Limikra hiktima hakasav. It just means in the psukim, the ola comes first. Shetei nikris be'inyan tchila, again in the parsha, that's what's mentioned first. Avol ba'avodasim, but when it comes to the avoda, chatas kodemes, the chatas actually does come first. Ucheda amran mi zeh bona'av, like we said above, from zeh bona'av, other Rishonim have a different interpretation of Limikra hiktima hakasav, but in any case, Rashi understands that it just means in the psukim, the ola comes first. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here, the following proof. The Brisa says, Parim kodmin la'elim, in terms of animals, bulls come before rams, ve'elim kodmin la'chavasim, and rams come before sheep, and chavasim la'seirim, sheep come before goats. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Amid Beis.